A German shepherd gave birth to 15 puppies in one single night. At first, the veterinarian thought it was just an unusual case. But the moment she picked up her flashlight and looked closely, everything changed. The puppies did not look normal. Their eyes were too sharp. Their ears reacted to sound before the doctor even spoke. Their movements were coordinated, intelligent, almost calculated. When the police officer entered the clinic and saw them, he froze in place, covered his mouth with his hand, and whispered, "Doctor, what are these?" Dr. Grace could only shake her head. These are not normal puppies. Something is very, very wrong, or very, very rare. And just when they were trying to understand what they had witnessed, 3 black vehicles appeared through the fog outside the clinic. No sirens, no markings, just slow, deliberate movement, as if they already knew what was inside. What happened next shocked the entire town and turned a simple birth into the beginning of a fight no one was prepared for. If you enjoy real-life inspired mystery stories like this, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment which city or country you are watching from. Now let's begin the story. The north wind off the Texas plains turned Marlin Creek into a white hush that swallowed sound. At 3:08 a.m., the metal awning above the Whitfield Animal Clinic rattled like an old screen door, and Dr. Grace Whitfield woke to a sound she'd never heard in 43 years of work. A frantic, scraping claw against the glass, sharp and rhythmic, as if someone were dragging a fork across a plate and begging her to listen. Grace swung her feet into her boots, shrugged into a quilted barn coat, and limped down the hall past the surgery lights and the framed 4-H ribbons from kids she'd patched up animals for. She was 68 now, a widow with a stiff right hip that complained in cold weather, and a heart that still folded in on itself when she looked too long at the photograph near reception. Hank in his feed store cap, smiling like the sun would never set on them. She reached the front door and wiped the fog off the glass with her sleeve. A German shepherd stood there, massive and trembling, ice crusted along her whiskers and a glaze of sleet on her back. The dog's eyes found Grace's face with a look that was both pleading and resolved. When Grace cracked the door, the animal surged in on a blast of freezing air, stumbled 2 steps and collapsed on the mat, her belly hard with labor, breath coming in shuddering pants. "Oh, honey," Grace said, already kneeling. "You found the right place. Stay with me." Everything after that was muscle memory. She locked the door, kicked the heater higher, dragged 2 IV poles close and snapped on the gooseneck lamp over exam 2. She slid a thick towel beneath the dog, checked gum color, pulse, dilation. The contractions were stacked too close. A hard winter front had turned the county roads into a sheet of glass. There would be no text tonight, no help from town, just her and the dog and whatever the Lord allowed. "Nova," she said out loud. The name rose in her without thought. "I'm calling you Nova. You and me are gonna do this." The first pup crowned 5 minutes later. Grace cleared the airway, rubbed the tiny body until a cry sparked, set it against Nova. Then another. And another. The minutes fell away, replaced by a tempo of breath, cry, rub, tie, cut, place. Her hands, knuckled and stiff with age, but moved sure and quick. The generator coughed once, steadied. A wet snow hissed against the window panes and began to pack in the corners like cement. By the 3rd pup, a knot of unease formed at the base of Grace's throat. The paws were big, not just large the way shepherds throw big-boned pups, oversized with splayed toes built for grip. The ears were narrow and high, not folding the way she expected. The cries weren't the soft, blind mules she could identify in her sleep. They were sharp, whistling calls that made the hair rise along her forearms. She told herself not to get fanciful. Cold nights and no sleep turned any cry strange. By the 7th, it wasn't fancy anymore. Nova labored like an athlete pushed past the red line, focused, almost too aware. When Grace spoke, the dog's eyes flicked to her face, reading her voice as if words mattered. "You're doing perfect," Grace whispered, laying a warm compress across the taut belly. "Just like that. I've got you." Number 11 came breech, and for a long minute there was only the work. The cool, efficient slide of a gloved finger, the twist to free a shoulder, the rub that becomes prayer. When that pup finally breathed, Grace laughed in relief that almost broke into a sob. She glanced at the old clock radio on the counter, 4:27 a.m., and thought of Hank, who would have brought coffee and said something like, "Always did like to show off, Doc," and then stood back, proud. 15. by the time the last one slid into her waiting hands. The floor around the towel was a storm map of damp footprints and footprints again, the heat lamps glowing red over a whelping box she'd improvised from surgical blankets and a feed tub. 15 living things. 15 cries that rose and fell in a chorus that didn't sound like anything she'd heard in this room. The clinic smelled of iodine and wet fur and the faint tin of blood, the ordinary smells of birth. And yet nothing about this felt ordinary. Grace washed up at the sink and leaned her hip against the counter. Watching. Nova gathered the pups with that peculiar gentle strength mothers have, curling her body to form a wall. The lamp caught a faint tracery of scars along Nova's flank. Not fence wire, not barbed tangle, not coyote. Thin, straight lines like the memory of a surgeon's hand. "Where did you come from?" Grace murmured. Snow packed higher on the windows, dimming the room to a warm cave. The landline on the wall was a dead stone. Ice had the lines. Cell service had been a rumor here since the tower ice over last week. She was alone on County Road 9 with a dog who had walked through a storm to lay 15 impossible pups at her feet. She dried her hands and reached for the microchip scanner out of habit. Every stray that set paw in her exam room got scanned. Sometimes you found a kid's missing pet and made a miracle phone call. She started with the pups, more to busy her hands than expecting anything. One after another the screen flashed red, no chip found. At the 10th pup the scanner chirped, a faint, improbable beep. She frowned and looked down at the tiny creature in her palm, still slick with birth and blinking in the light. She scanned again. The display sputtered, then stabilized into a line of text. Property, Sable Ridge Research Series, Lupa K9, Cohort 5, Custody, Federal. The room seemed to tilt. She scanned Nova next, heart already climbing her throat. The reader buzzed and spat out more lines. Subject, SRR 47, Nova. Genetic Modification Protocol. Active Chain of Custody. Unauthorized Removal. 6Y Grace set the scanner on the counter like it might burn through her palm. 6 years. That was how long Nova had been in Marlin Creek without a chip reading. She had taken this dog in once before. A foundling with ugly scars she'd chalked up to cruelty. She had stitched and healed and never thought to scan again. Shame pricked the back of her neck. No, not shame. A colder thing. Outside wind banged the metal sign against its chain, a hollow, lonely sound. In the hush that followed, Grace heard tires. Not one set, several. Slow, careful, the way people drove when they were trying not to be noticed. Her first thought was the sheriff, Martha Collins, checking on her in the storm. But Martha drove a county Ford with a fan belt that squealed 2 blocks away. These engines had that muffled, expensive hum that came with rental contracts and federal plates. Not yet, Grace whispered, and moved. She gathered formula thermal blankets, a portable incubator unit she'd bought used when a rancher's litter needed around-the-clock care. 2 heating pads, a tote of syringes, the good stethoscope Hank had given her for their 30th anniversary. She snapped off the overheads and left the lamp pools glowing warm and small, then crossed the hall to the storage room where a trapdoor sat under a rolling rack of dog kibble. Hank had poured that cellar in '83 when the town was certain the Russians were going to point something at Texas. Reinforced concrete, passive venting. No one used it anymore except for tornado watches and a place to keep the good canned peaches cool. "Come on, girl," she said, hauling the rack aside and levering the trap door up. Cold breath rolled up from the stairs. "Gently now," Nova stood. She was weak, but her eyes were bright and not afraid. Grace lifted 2 pups at a time into the incubator, then carried the unit down and set it inside the cellar door while Nova watched. On the 3rd trip, Nova moved first, picking her way down the steps with the balance of a dog who had learned caution the hard way. She lay in the corner Grace pointed to, and one by one the pups landed against her belly like magnets finding north. Grace flicked on the cellar's emergency lights, set the heater to a low hum, and listened. The sound of 15 small mouths working, the deep, steady breathing of a dog who had done everything asked of her and was now guarding the world she'd made. When she climbed back up and eased the trapdoor closed, the clinic felt like a stage set waiting for the wrong actors. The generator hiccuped again and steadied. Out front, headlights slid across the snow-banked glass in slow arcs and went still. Doors opened, closed, boots on gravel. Someone tried the front handle, found it locked and knocked. A firm, official cadence that wanted to be obeyed. Grace stood behind the counter, palm flat on the wood to quiet the tremor in her hand. If it was Martha, she'd call out and use her name. If it was a neighbor, they'd be yelling, "Doc!" through the door. The knock came again. 3 hard pounds. The landline, dead a minute ago, rang. Grace stared at it and did not move. It rang again, the old bell sound so loud in the quiet that it felt obscene. On the 3rd ring, she picked up. Whitfield Animal Clinic. A man's voice, smooth as a courtroom and twice as cold. "Dr. Whitfield, we know what you have. We're here to retrieve our property. This will go easier for everyone if you cooperate." She swallowed. "You've got the wrong place. Subject SRR-47, the voice said, unhurried. Female, alias Nova. You've had unauthorized custody for approximately 6 years. You just delivered cohort 5. We appreciate your veterinary expertise. Now open the door." Her eyes fell to the scanner on the counter, still lit with the last line it had shown. Chain of custody. Unauthorized removal. 6Y. "How about you show me a warrant with a judge's signature?" she said, surprised to hear her voice hold steady. "And how about you keep your men from damaging my building while you look for it?" A pause, not long, enough to tell her she'd hit something that mattered. "We won't ask again," the man said, softer. "Failure to comply will be treated as obstruction of a federal operation." The line went dead. Grace set the receiver down and let herself feel the fear, just for one heartbeat. The old hollow kind she'd first known when the army car had turned onto her dirt lane all those years ago. Then she moved. She swept the floor for any clue that the cellar existed, slid the rug back over the seams, rolled the kibble rack into place, scattered a handful of harmless charts across it so it looked like a table again. She pulled a file from the cremation drawer and filled out a form with a steady pen. Canine F, German Shepherd, dystocia complications, stillborn litter. She left the form on the clipboard by the back door where anyone nosy would find it. The knock came a 3rd time, heavier, angry. Outside, more doors shut. Footsteps spread. Someone tried the back latch. A flashlight cut white across the frosted window of the treatment room. Grace took the shotgun down from the peg Hank had installed behind reception after a string of break-ins years back. She checked the chamber, set the butt against the floor, and breathed. Her hands didn't shake now. There was work to do, and she had done hard work her whole life. She walked to the door and looked at the men on her porch. Black parkas. No badges visible. One held up a leather wallet with something shiny in it, too quick for her to read. Another kept his hand near his belt like he wanted her to notice. Grace cracked the door 2 inches and let the cold bite her cheeks. "Clinic's closed," she said. "Emergency only." "We're the emergency," the leader said and smiled without his eyes.
Federal Wildlife Enforcement.
"We have reports of illegal trafficking and possession of protected animals at this address." "Open up." "Wildlife?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "At a vet clinic? You boys lose a map?" "Open the door, ma'am." "I'll call the sheriff," she said and started to close it. The man's smile went flat. "We'll make this simple, Dr. Whitfield. You have animals belonging to Sable Ridge Research on these premises. Federal property. You will turn them over now." In the quiet that followed, Grace heard a sound from below her feet. Not a cry, not even a whine. The faint shift of a mother resettling around her newborns. Her throat closed. She pictured Nova's eyes in the red glow of the cellar, that lucid, unblinking trust. She met the man's gaze through the crack in the door and felt her spine do something it hadn't done in a long time. Lock in place. "Then you'll need a warrant," she said. "And Sheriff Collins." She shut the door and threw the deadbolt that clicked loud as a gunshot. Outside, the men conferred. One stepped off the porch, boots crunching on crusted snow. Another circled toward the back. Grace turned off the last of the lights and stood in the dim, listening to the generator's steady hum and the wind's long breath, and beneath it all, the quiet heartbeat of the room that had held so many beginnings and endings. On the counter, the scanner's screen dimmed and went black. She picked up the phone again and dialed the only number that mattered before anyone else got in. Martha's personal line. It rang twice. "Collins." "Martha, it's Grace," she whispered. "I need you at the clinic. Bring real paperwork and that stubborn streak your daddy gave you. And hurry." A fist pounded the door. Another flashlight swept the frosted glass. Somewhere outside, a second set of engines rolled in, slow and deliberate, like someone very sure they belonged here. Grace looked toward the floor where the cellar lay hidden and felt the old room gather itself around her. The smell of hay and disinfectant and coffee. The photographs of farm kids and horses with their winter coats. The ghost of Hank's laugh. "All right, Nova," she said, voice steady again. "We're going to hold the line." Sheriff Martha Collins made good time even with the county roads turned to glass. Grace heard the familiar growl of the sheriff's Tahoe before she saw the wash of blue strobe slide across the snow-plastered windows. On the front porch, the men in black parkas went still. Their leader half-turned, measuring how much authority had just arrived. Grace breathed once, slow, and set the shotgun out of sight behind reception. She opened the door a cautious crack. "Morning, Doc," Martha called, voice clipped by the wind. "Heard a ruckus." "Morning," Grace said, as if it were any other farm call at daybreak. "You want to tell your friends they're about to break my hinges?" The leader showed that wallet again, a flash of metal and embossing. "Federal Wildlife Enforcement. You're obstructing—" "Wildlife Enforcement doesn't work nights on a county road in a blizzard," Martha cut in, calm as a sunrise. "And they sure don't show up without my office looped in. You got a warrant, sweetheart? A real one with a judge's name I recognize?" The man's smile thinned. "Exigent circumstances." "Exigent is when a bull's on the highway," Martha said. "This is my jurisdiction. Step off the porch." 2 more county SUVs pulled in behind Martha, their lights throwing long blue ladders across the drifts. Deputy Ruiz took up position by the back corner of the building, hands out where everyone could see them, not touching his sidearm, not needing to. The men in parkas shifted, recalculating. They didn't leave, but they listened. "Ma'am," the leader said to Grace, tone sliding into something almost reasonable. "We have credible information that animals owned by a federal contractor are on these premises. There's a serious public safety risk. We need to inspect your kennels." Grace met his eyes and thought of the cellar's soft red light. 15 bodies pressed against Nova's warmth. "No kennels in use, and I'm not in the habit of letting strangers into my clinic while I have patients down." "We can come back with paper," he warned. "And when you do," Martha said, "you can knock like gentlemen and wait on the step. Until then, move along." She angled her chin toward Ruiz. "Plate numbers, please." The men hesitated 2 beats too long, then backed off the porch in a single ripple. Engines turned. Tires chewed sloppy tracks through the lot. As they pulled out, the lead driver rolled down his window and gave Grace one last look that said he wasn't done. Only delayed. The blizzard swallowed their taillights. The lot dimmed to the normal blue flicker of county presence. Grace let herself breathe. Inside, with the door locked again, Martha stamped snow off her boots and shook the wet off her Stetson. "You all right?" she asked, voice lower now, the official steel wrapped back up and set aside. "I am," Grace said. It surprised her to find the words true. Her hands had steadied. The old building had steadied with her. "You want to tell me what they were really after?" Grace had rehearsed the lie in the minute before Martha came through the door. It didn't even feel like a lie, not to the part of her that kept animals alive. "Client brought a shepherd in," she said, not trusting herself to use the name that had leapt into her mouth in the dark. "Bad labor. We lost the litter. I've got forms started for cremation." Martha's eyes, the color of river mud in winter, searched Grace's face and then drifted. Slow and deliberate over the room, the towels, the heat lamp still warm, the faint metallic tang of birth that disinfectant never quite erases. She didn't look toward the floor where the trapdoor hid beneath the kibble rack. Martha had grown up here. She knew where every ranch hand stashed their liquor, and every farmhouse hid their weather radio. If she noticed the rearranged sign-in table, the way the rug sat just off true, she didn't let on. "Reporters are going to circle once the sun's up," she said at last. "Those boys'll spin you into something noisy if they can. I'd appreciate it if you didn't talk to anyone till I know what I'm dealing with." "Wasn't planning on talking to anyone at all," Grace said. Martha nodded. "I'll have Ruiz cruise past a few extra times today. Call me direct if you see anyone parkside." She started to turn, then paused with her hand on the doorknob. "Doc, If you're in over your head, don't drown out of pride." "I'll wait in." Grace's throat tightened. "I know." When the sheriff's trucks finally ghosted back down County Road 9 and the blue climbed off the walls, the clinic fell into that deep electric quiet storms carry, the kind that makes you aware of every hum. The generator held steady. The space heater ticked as it cycled. Somewhere in the ducts, warm air sighed. Grace rolled the kibble rack aside and lifted the trapdoor just enough to send down a palm of air and a word. "Still with me?" A soft chuff rose barely there. She lowered the door and slid the rack back, hand lingering on the wood as if she could feel Nova through it. Then she washed her hands, made coffee that tasted like a wet barn, and sat at Hank's old oak desk because the next necessary thing had arrived, knowing what she was up against. The scanner lay where she'd set it, its screen dead now. She woke the clinic computer, the antique whir almost comforting. Satellite internet in Marlin Creek worked when it felt like it. The storm made it sulk. Still, the search box blinked and her fingers found the keys as if they'd been waiting for this precise task. Sable Ridge Research, a dozen results. A glossy website with photos of scrubland and collared pronghorns. Language about conservation genomics, public-private partnerships, and resilient ecosystems. A press release about a research complex outside Waco, behind 3 miles of fence line locals called the Ridge like it had always been there. Another page buried 3 layers down. A grant abstract with phrases that made her stomach go cold. Hybrid fitness. Founder effect mitigation. Canine sentinel species. She clicked an article from the Austin Sentinel. Whistleblower alleges animal welfare violations at Sable Ridge facility. The text was thin on real details. No reporter got through those gates. But it mentioned a former tech by name. A woman who'd lasted 11 months before quitting and filing statements with the Texas Attorney General. Dogs, wolves, something in between. Breeding cohorts. Shipment receipts redacted like a crime novel. Federal contracts through 2 different agencies. One of them a shell address in Virginia, Grace. Pushed back from the desk and went to the corner of the office she almost never visited. The bookcase with Hank's ledgers and the 2-drawer filing cabinet under the window. Hank had been a feed store philosopher, not a man of secrets. But even simple men keep drawers no one opens. The top drawer held exactly what it should. Receipts, vaccination logs, the odd Polaroid of a 4-H kid with a blue ribbon, and a goat that looked bored by its own success. The bottom drawer stuck. She jiggled it, cussed it, jiggled again and felt the faintest give, like a catch sliding against a coin. Hank used to hide the spare key behind the Founders Day photo. She lifted the frame, fingers finding old Scotch tape and the cool edge of brass. The key turned. The drawer sighed out. Inside, a manila folder with her name in Hank's careful block print. 3 photocopied journal articles about canid hybridization. So technical she had to sound out the titles. A stack of emails printed out in the ugly font of some government system. And at the bottom, a letter in Hank's hand. "Gracie, if you're reading this, you're digging where I hoped you'd never have to. I didn't tell you because I figured knowing would make you a target. I reckon I was wrong either way. A fella named Gideon Vale came to me 6 years back. Said he'd worked with me in Lubbock in the 70s. I didn't remember him, but he remembered enough to make it true. He had a dog in the back of his truck, cut up and scared. He said she'd wandered in off the river and he couldn't keep her. I took her because that's who I am. 2 days later, I figured out what he'd really brought me. You would have too. A dog that wasn't quite dog who watched like she knew the names of things. I've been keeping her quiet. If anyone asks, she's a ranch mix we spayed and placed. Don't use her name in a room you don't trust. There's something dirty under Sable Ridge's shine. It smells like money and men who never held a dying animal's head. If I'm gone, be careful who you call. If you have to choose between papers and kindness, choose kindness. It carries farther, I love you. Lock the back door. The room narrowed until all she could see was the tilt of Hank's letters, the way his H swooped. She read it twice, then once more, and only then let herself sit with the truth that had been pacing just out of sight. Hank had known. He'd taken Nova on purpose. He'd built a quiet wall around her with nothing but his name and his habit of being useful. Grace replaced the letter with hands that didn't feel like they belonged to her, shut the drawer and slid the key back where it had slept behind the photo of their younger faces. Outside, the storm lost its voice. The wind guttered down from a howl to a tired sigh. Dawn had come without anyone noticing. The landline rang again. Grace felt her whole body brace even as she reached. "Whitfield Animal Clinic. Dr. Whitfield?" A woman's voice this time, tired around the edges but clear. "This is Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the Federal Bureau of Investigation out of Waco. Sheriff Collins gave me your number." Grace didn't speak for a heartbeat. She had learned a long time ago that the first person to fill the silence lost the hand. "I'm on County Road 9 now," the woman continued. I'm calling before I hit your lot so we don't spook each other. My people have been tracking activity at Sable Ridge. Your location pinged on a vehicle sweep last night from individuals associated with that facility. I'd like to make sure you're safe." Grace closed her eyes briefly and pictured the cellar, the red glow, the soft sounds. "I'm fine," she said. "We had visitors, not mine," Torres said. "I'll show you the paperwork you asked the last group to produce." The phone clicked off. 2 minutes later, another set of headlights moved into the lot. Careful, nothing showy, followed by the sheriff's Tahoe again, Martha keeping the playing field level. Grace opened the door before they reached it. Agent Torres was younger than Grace expected. 40s maybe, hair pulled back, coat too thin for the cold like people from cities always wore. She held out credentials. Grace took her time reading them. U.S. Department of Justice. Designation legit. The agent's eyes were kind but flint pure behind it, like she'd seen enough to know better and kept showing up anyway. "Dr. Whitfield," Torres said. "May we come in?" "You may," Grace said, stepping back. "One condition, no shouting, no stomping, no sudden moves. I've got patients recovering." Torres nodded at that like it was a reasonable law of physics. Martha followed, posted near the door with the relaxed attention of a woman who could take apart a situation and put it back together without raising her voice. Torres's gaze swept, cataloging, but not with the hungry taking of the men in parkas. "We intercepted comms suggesting Sable Ridge believes a high-value animal is here," she said. "They also believe you assisted in the delivery of offspring that belong to them under the terms of a federal contract." Grace's jaw went tight. "Animals aren't inventory." "I agree," Torres said simply. "But the paper they hide behind doesn't. I need to ask you 2 questions, and I'm asking them as a person first, then as an agent. 1, are you or anyone else in immediate danger? 2, are there animals here who need urgent medical care?" Grace could have cried for the way the questions were asked. "No," she said to the first. "Yes," to the second, because 15 newborns is always urgent in its way, and Nova would need calcium and rest and quiet. Torres let out a breath that fogged the cold air still trapped in the foyer. "Then here's the third thing, this one from the agent part. If Sable Ridge animals are on site, they're evidence. They'll push hard to seize them. My job is to make sure chain of custody doesn't equal cruelty. If we can keep them safe where they are under your care, while we sort the legal end, I'll do the paperwork dance till my feet fall off. But I need the truth now so I don't get outplayed." Grace looked to Martha. The sheriff's face gave nothing away except a steadying weight, like a hand on the shoulder in a bad storm. "I have a mother and newborns," Grace said. Saying it out loud let some knot undo in her chest. "They're safe and warm where no one will stumble on them. If you take them now, you'll kill them. If you let me do what I've done 40 years, they'll have a chance." Torres didn't move for a moment. Then she nodded once, decision made. "All right. You keep doing the medicine. I'll do the law. How good's your law?" Grace asked because honesty begged for it. Torres's mouth tipped, almost a smile, almost not. "Sometimes good enough." From below the floor, as if answering, came the subtlest sound. The quick, contented squeak of a nursing pup, the soft huff of a mother shifting to cover a back that had cooled. Torres heard it. Martha heard it. None of them looked down. "Is there anyone else who knows what you have?" Torres asked. "The men who left, and now you 2. Grace hesitated. "And my husband before he passed." He knew more than I did. Torres's eyes flicked toward Hank's desk. "Then let's get ahead of the next knock," she said. "I'll post 2 agents at the end of the lane and run plates on every vehicle that so much as slows down. Sheriff Collins will handle locals. And Dr. Whitfield. If a man named Gideon Vale shows up looking like a church elder with a science degree, don't open your door. He sits on the Sable Ridge Advisory Board and thinks he's God's lawyer." Grace swallowed the sudden irrational urge to laugh. Of course the devil would have a respectable name. Noted. An hour later, after Torres made a dozen calls that sounded like chess moves and Martha wrote down half the county's names on a legal pad just in case, the clinic eased into a new kind of morning. The snow lifted in slow curtains. Light found the windows. Someone in town would already be making biscuits and wondering why the sheriff's Tahoe had headed north. Grace took a tray of supplies and, with Torres's quiet nod, opened the trapdoor and stepped down into the warm, red-lit hush. Nova lifted her head, eyes bright and clear. She didn't bare teeth. She didn't tremble. She watched Grace set calcium gels and fresh water within reach. watched her count noses and check bellies and weigh the smallest on a postal scale, because that's what you do with runts on day one. The puppy's paws, those great splayed snowshoes, flexed and settled. Their ears, too sharp for any registry chart, twitched at the soft clink of the water bowl. "You found the right door," Grace murmured, smoothing an ear that felt like silk, "and I'll keep it shut." When she climbed back up, Agent Torres was waiting at the top of the stairs, careful not to look past Grace's shoulder. "How's the mother?" "Strong. Smarter than I am, hungry." Torres nodded. "I've got a proposal to float up the chain. Temporary protective custody on site. It's unusual. It'll make enemies. It's also the only thing that doesn't end in cruelty." Grace leaned a hip against the wall and let her head touch the plaster. She was so tired she could feel sleep like an edge under her feet. Waiting. "Do the dance," she said. "I'll do the bottles." Torres started toward the door, phone already ringing again, then paused. "One more thing. The group that came last night will try again. They'll come cleaner next time. Real badges, real signatures, real impatience. When they do, they'll press you to say this is about science. Make them say the word welfare out loud. Make them say humane. It boxes their lawyers in later." Grace almost smiled. "You sure you're an agent? Sounds like you've done barn chores." "I grew up bottle-feeding kittens behind a bodega in El Paso," Torres said. And there it was, the flash of a kid who had learned early to make small lives matter. "I learned 2 things. How to hold 5 squirming things at once and how to smell a lie. Sable Ridge smells like money pretending to be mercy." When the agent and the sheriff left, when the lot held only the wind-carved dunes of snow and the long scars of old tire tracks, Grace locked the door, poured herself another cup of barn coffee, and sat with Hank's letter open again. She traced the swoop of the H, the way he'd told her to lock the back door like he was saying it in the kitchen before he went out to check the cattle. The phone rang a 3rd time. No strobes outside. No engines. Just that old bell sound vibrating the air. Grace lifted the receiver. "Whitfield," silence. Then a man's voice warm as a deacon's handshake. "Dr. Whitfield, I hate that we got off on the wrong foot. My name is Dr. Gideon Vale. We share friends in common. I believe you cared for an animal very dear to me." Every hair on Grace's arms lifted. "I think you should come by the clinic," she said, so calm she surprised herself. "We can talk on the porch. You can bring your paperwork." "Oh, I'll bring more than paper," Dr. Vale said softly. "I'll bring the future you're holding hostage under your floor." Grace set the phone down like it might shatter. Outside, the storm had finally ended. But in the clear, bright stillness of a Texas morning, she could feel the next front moving toward her, the kind with teeth and lawyers and words that didn't mean what they said. She went to the cellar one more time, just to look, just to breathe the warm, milk and wet fur air, and to let Nova see her face. "We're not done," she whispered. "But we're not alone, either." Nova blinked, slow and certain, then lowered her head to her impossible children, as if the room above them and all its dangers could be held at bay by the simple, ancient rhythm of nursing. Grace climbed back into the light and started a list the way she always had when fear tried to make a mess of her hands. Syringes to refill, saline to warm, calcium to dose, coffee to brew for whoever showed up next on her side of the line. By late morning, the storm had shaved the world down to clean lines, fence posts iced in glass, a sky so sharp it looked cut with a knife. The plow trucks had not yet found County Road 9, but the wind had quit, and sound carried in a way it doesn't on humid days. Grace could hear the drip of thaw from the awning and the distant clatter of someone's metal gate slapping a post. She did her rounds with a ritual she'd perfected over decades: sanitize, check Nova's gums, count respirations, weigh the 2 smallest pups and mark their numbers in pencil on a notepad so soft with age the paper felt like cloth. Nova Ade warmed chicken broth laced with calcium paste and kept one eye on the stairs the whole time, as if she understood that danger, like a winter front, didn't always announce itself loudly. It just arrived and stayed. Upstairs, the clinic smelled of coffee and dog shampoo, the comforting baseline of her life. Grace set the kettle back on its ring and looked at the clock. 11:12 a.m. Agent Torres had promised to call when she had something with teeth. The sheriff would loop back after her lunch patrol. In the lull, Grace couldn't stop her hands from straightening what didn't need straightening. The cotton ball jar, the stack of discharge forms, the framed photo of Hank accepting a blue ribbon from a boy whose steer had become half the boy's personality for a year. The landline rang. Not the brittle ring of robocalls, but a steady, patient summons. Grace picked up. Whitfield. Dr. Whitfield, the man said, smooth as if his voice had been dusted with powdered sugar. Gideon Vale again. I'm in the lot. I brought what you asked for. She stepped to the front window and eased the blind with 2 fingers. A white SUV idled nose to door. No government plates. Vale looked like he'd been printed from a template titled Respectable. Tan coat, navy scarf, gray at the temples that had chosen a flattering decade to arrive. He held a leather folio against his chest and a paper cup in his other hand, like he'd brought decency with the coffee. Front porch, Grace said. You can show me your paper on the porch. He laughed softly as if she'd told a sweet joke. Porch it is. She opened the door but left the glass locked, a habit she'd been grateful for 3 times in her life and now again. Vale wore the kind of cologne that pretended not to be cologne. He set the paper cup on the rail. Black, he said. I asked the kid at the gas station how you take it. I'll make my own. Of course. He angled the folio so she could see a sheaf of documents peeking out. Emergency custody order from a federal magistrate authorizing the transfer of Sable Ridge assets from unsecured locations pending adjudication. Page 2 references live assets. Page 3 lists my authority to collect. Grace didn't touch the glass. You brought me a printout of your wishes and called it a court order. Now why would you assume bad faith? He pulled a page free and pressed it to the window. There was a seal. There was a signature. And there were 2 words that did not belong together in her world. Lev property. Fish and Wildlife doesn't use that language in any humane context, she said. And you're not Fish and Wildlife. We are a federal contractor, he said. We carry the obligations others don't want to carry. New science makes new words. Live property covers chain of custody in a way that turns mothers into inventory, Grace said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice, the way it walked away from fear toward anger. Like the ground had tilted and given it permission. You have something else to show me? A warrant with my name on it? Judge case number sheriff looped in? Because Sheriff Collins doesn't like surprises. His mouth tightened. Sheriff Collins likes re-election. She likes dogs and people who don't lie to her. We are losing species by the week. Dr. Whitfield, Vale said, and there it was. The sermon to dress the hunger. You of all people should understand a program designed to create resilient canids that can anchor restored ecosystems. We're on the right side of history. Is that what you tell the techs who bottle feed your mistakes? Grace asked. History? He smiled in a way that wasn't a smile. You think in stories, Doctor. I think in outcomes. Bring me the animals. I'll ensure their welfare is... You say welfare like a man who scraped it off his shoe, Grace said. For the first time, something flashed through his eyes. Surprise, then calculation. The folio edge tapped the glass twice, a soft, impatient metronome. Let's not make a scene, he said, as if the empty road and drifting snow were an audience. I'd hate to involve people who are less careful than I am. Careful landed like a threat dressed in flannel. Grace stepped back from the door. Leave my porch, Dr. Vale. Sheriff Collins will meet you at the end of the lane if you want to discuss your paperwork. He didn't move. He lifted the paper cup, took a sip he did not need, and set it back down as if leaving a gift. Then he turned and walked to his SUV without looking back. The engine reversed slow, too slow, as if a camera behind the rear glass were hungry for angles. Then he pulled out, sending up a fan of powder that dressed the plow berm like sugar on a cake. Grace locked the deadbolt and breathed once, twice. Her hands felt like her own again. She reached for the phone to call Torres, and it rang under her palm. Agent Torres, she said. Already watched him leave on the county camera. Torres answered. I'm 2 miles south. I bought us time. Judge didn't like the words on his papers either. I need to be at your door in 20. Can you hold your line without interacting with anyone else till then? Yes. Good. Also, I filed for something creative. Call it on-site protective custody under veterinary supervision. It's ugly law, but if it sticks, it keeps them in your care with federal oversight instead of a lab. Does it have teeth? It has molars, Torres said. Not pretty ones, but they grind. When the call ended, Grace took the coffee cup Vale had left and walked it to the dumpster out back with tongs, the way she'd carry a dead snake. The air had warmed just enough to send a thin fog off the snow in a way that always made Hank claim angels were ironing sheets. Back inside, She checked the back latch twice, then lifted the trapdoor and went down into the hush. Nova's head lifted. Grace knelt and let the dog smell her wrists the way she always had after touching the outside world. Nova licked once, a stamp of approval, and lowered her muzzle to the pup whose belly refused to fill as quickly as his siblings. Scout, Grace said, choosing a name she had no right to and giving it anyway. You're trouble already. She slid a finger under his jaw, felt the little tug of determination and smiled. The smallest female, the one who had opened her eyes first, though she shouldn't have yet, had already figured out the heat lamp meant something, and had inched herself toward the brightest part of the red puddle. Luna, Grace said softly. You're the brains. The clinic phone rang once. She let it go. It rang again and she let it go again. On the third ring she climbed because some instincts you don't ignore even when you want to. Whitfield. Door, Martha said. Me, Grace opened. The sheriff stamped in, hat dusted, cheeks ruddy. Torres is 6 minutes out. She wants to bring a second vehicle with a vet from AFIS who's the good kind of nosy. I can live with nosy. Martha lowered her voice. I ran Vale's plates through a friend who owes me. They hopscotched through 2 LLCs and land at a P.O. box in Arlington that smells like federal contractor. He's not bluffing about connections. But that order he waved? The judge on the seal signed off on a fishing case last week at Lake Whitney. I texted her clerk. She didn't sign a custody order this morning. That paper is a postcard in a suit. Then why do I still feel like I'm losing? Grace asked, more to the room than the sheriff. Because men like that get paid to make everyone feel behind, Martha said. We're not. As if choreographed, 2 sets of headlights turned up the lane in a stagger, a tan Tahoe and a government white sedan that looked like it had spent its life ferrying people with briefcases. Agent Torres stepped out with a man in a quilted vest and scuffed boots who carried a hard case like a musician carries a trumpet. Dr. Whitfield, Torres said. This is Dr. Theo Mallory with USDA AFIS. He writes mean letters to bad labs and soft ones to good vets. Mallory grinned. I'm the pen. She's the hammer. May I not touch anything without you saying so? You may not, Grace said, and surprised herself with a laugh that felt like a release valve easing open. But you can drink the coffee I made for my enemies. They did the dance you do when strangers become allies quickly. First names offered. The minimum of jokes to show the right kind of human. The quiet acknowledgments of snow and roads and how far out the world can feel. Torres laid out her molar-toothed plan. A temporary order keeping evidence animals under existing veterinary control, with federal agents standing watch and daily checks logged like scripture. Mallory nodded through it like a man who knew which state inspectors would balk and which ones would quote statutes with compassion. May I look at the mother from a respectful distance? Mallory asked. Grace studied him the way she'd study a dog someone claimed was sweet, while it watched her hands like a game. He kept his gaze on Grace's face, not the floor, and waited. She led him down, Torres and Martha staying by the door without looking. Mallory stopped at the foot of the stairs and crouched. Hey there, he whispered, every line of his body speaking dog. You're doing the big job, I see. And you're not going to let me near those babies, which is fine by me. He glanced sideways at Grace. Paws like snowshoes, ears like radar. If that facility did what I think they did, they selected harder than they admitted. They put a chip in a day-old pup, Grace said. That's not selection. That's possession. Mallory's jaw flexed. If the order sticks, we can keep them here. If it doesn't, I have a plan B I'm not allowed to say out loud in front of my badge. Back upstairs, Torres's phone chirped. She listened, eyes narrowing, then glanced at Martha. Vale's back, she said. Not alone. 2 SUVs behind him. He brought people who don't wear cologne. Martha checked her watch like time could be bullied into behaving. I'll meet them at the lane. You stay with the doc. Mallory set his case by the counter and snapped it open. Not syringes, cameras, tags, a small printer that whirred like a polite bee. If this becomes official in the way we want, he said, we'll need photos, weights, notations. Evidence and welfare are enemies until we make them shake hands. Grace nodded. I've got weights. Of course you do, he said, and the respect in his voice loosened a knot she hadn't known she'd tied around her own competence. Through the frosted glass, they watched the convoy stop at the end of the lane. Martha's Tahoe parked sideways across the road, a farmer's version of a roadblock. Vale got out alone again and left his men in their cars. which told Grace he either knew the sheriff's temper or had read enough Texans to know you didn't send boys onto a woman's land without an invitation. Torres's phone buzzed. She listened, then smiled without letting it reach her eyes. "The judge signed," she said. "Ugly order with the pretty teeth. On-site custody under veterinary supervision, enforced by federal agents and county law. If Vale wants them, he gets to read my logs every morning like the paper." Grace exhaled something that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. She gripped the counter to make sure her knees remembered their job. "Don't celebrate yet," Torres added. "He'll try to poke holes. He'll argue unique genetics and risk of flight." "Am I a flight risk?" Grace asked. "You're a woman with a cellar," Torres said. "That's close enough for a man like him." Minutes lengthened. Snow ticked. Then the front door shivered to a measured knock. Not Vale. Martha's rhythm. 3 and a pause. The way she'd knocked since the days when radios cut out on the North Range and a body needed to know who was at the door before they let night in. Grace opened. The sheriff stepped in, followed by Vale, who stopped just inside like he needed the foyer to read the room before he performed. He clocked Torres. He clocked Mallory. He clocked the hard case and the faint smell of milk that had risen through the floor like cinnamon through an old house. "Dr. Whitfield," he said gently, as if forgiving her. "I'm relieved sensible people have joined us. Agent Torres, I assume you finally recognize the federal stakes here." Torres held up a single page. "Judge Harper's order. On-site custody. My agents will post at the lane. Sheriff Collins will manage locals. You may file your objections with the clerk like any other citizen." Vale's smile went tight. "Adorable. You think a county sheriff and an agent with a soft spot can hold back the inevitability of progress?" Mallory's voice came mild from near the counter. "Progress that starts with a knife and a breeding chart is often just hubris that can spell." Vale ignored him. He took a single step toward Grace and lowered his voice. "Call them up, doctor. Bring the mother. Let my team assess. If you cooperate now, I can recommend leniency in how we—" "Assessed a mother once," Grace said. She delivered twins in a barn in August and torn herself inside to get them both breathing. I stitched her by lantern light, and her husband held the flashlight with hands that shook, because love can make cowboys soft. "You want to talk assessment? We can talk about whether your men know how to tie umbilicals with their eyes closed." For a hair-width instant, something like admiration flickered in his face. Then it hardened into the look he'd used on donors who wrote 6-figure checks at luncheons. He spread his hands. "You think you're angry at me?" he said softly. "You're angry at the future for arriving without asking permission." "Sometimes the future needs to use the front door and wipe its feet," Grace said. Before he could reply, the building changed around them, a shift so small only people who listened for a living would have heard it. In the red hush below, a pup woke and let out a thin, questioning sound. It was barely more than a thread of air, but it traveled through the vent like a secret in a church. Vale's eyes cut to the floor. He didn't move. He smiled, slow and certain, the way a man smiles when a combination clicks under his fingers. "There you are," he whispered, not to Grace, not to Torres, but to the warm space beneath their feet. "I knew you wouldn't let them go far." Torres stepped between him and the hallway with a movement that was not theatrical at all. "This conversation is over." "On the contrary," Vale said. "This is where it begins." His hand twitched, not toward a weapon, not toward paper, and toward the door, a signal slick as a wink. Engines outside revved. Boots hit snow. The foyer filled with cold air as the door behind Vale cracked open on a draft none of them had invited. "Sheriff," Torres said, even as Martha was already moving, hand out, palm flat, her body a stop sign wrapped in a woman who'd grown up throwing hay bales. "Not another step," the sheriff said to the silhouettes filling the porch. "We've got an order, boys, and I brought my mean reading glasses." For a heartbeat, everything in the room held its breath. The coffee steam, the dust in the beam of winter light, the 3 women's hearts beating like hooves on hard ground. Under their feet, in the warm dark, something shifted. A mother putting herself between a stair and the world. Grace did not reach for the shotgun. She reached for the list she'd started at dawn and added a line she'd never written before in 43 years of medicine. "Keep breathing until help lands." Then, to Vale, whose mouth was still shaped like triumph, she said, "I don't know what you think you hear, but I know what I hear. And what is that, doctor?" 15 small lives, she said, and one big one that will go through your throat before I let you touch them. By noon, the snow had hardened into a crust that held a boot print like wet cement. Sheriff Collins stood in the doorway with one palm up, the other near her radio, body square as a barn door. Behind her, 3 men in heavy parkas crowded the porch, steam lifting from their collars in the cold. Gideon Vale stayed just inside, half in, half out, as if the threshold itself gave him authority. Agent Torres didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Judge Harper's order is in effect, she said, the paper steady in her hand. On-site protective custody under veterinary supervision. My agents are posted at the lane. Any attempt to enter this building without my consent or the sheriff's is a federal offense. Vale's smile made a neat line. You've arranged a very charming stalemate, Agent. But you and I both know chain of custody means those animals remain vulnerable down there. The risk of tampering is high. Grace felt the floor in that one word. Down there. Like he'd laid a finger on the cellar door. She set her coffee aside before her hand decided to shake. The only tampering those pups are going to see is me warming their bellies and counting their breaths. Vale's eyes moved. Not to her face but to the room, the way the rug lay flush now. The faint warmth that rose through the vent, the red heat lamp glow leaking into the edges of the stairwell. He cataloged it all the way men cataloged auction cattle. Then the building blinked, not a metaphor, a pulse through the lights, a hiccup in the generator's hum. The overheads dimmed to a sallow yellow and came back, twice, 3 times. Mallory's head snapped toward the hall. That's fuel, he said. Or a line. Torres was already moving. Sheriff, I've got back, Martha said, pivoting into the wind and vanishing off the porch with the economy of a woman who knew where the generator sat because she'd helped park it there during a wildfire 5 years earlier. Grace didn't remember deciding to go for the trapdoor. She just found herself there, rolling the kibble rack with a hip and a shoulder and feeling every year in her bones. She lifted the hatch and hot air rose against her face like a living thing. Nova's head shot up. 15 small bodies stirred, the soft, satisfied squeaks shifting toward question. The generator coughed. The heat lamp flickered. Grace dropped to the bottom step in 2 motions that she would pay for later, and swept her palm along Nova's flank to calm her. Easy, Mama. It's just a hiccup. Mallory landed at her shoulder with a box of chemical heat packs already in his hands, ripping the foil with his teeth. 3 under the bedding. 2 along the wall for radiant. Rotate the smallest onto your body heat if we lose the lamp. His voice never rose above the tone you use for scared animals and tired medics. Above them, a door banged. Wind bullied its way up the hallway and nosed at the cellar opening. Grace looked up toward the sound and saw Agent Torres's silhouette step into the frame, backlit by winter glare. Someone cut the fuel line, she said. Martha's got a clamp on it. We'll restore flow, but we need 30 minutes. You can hold 30? Grace had spent a life holding animals through minutes longer than 30. Yes, she said, though the number sat cold in her gut. Mallory's hands moved like a magician's. Heat packs hissed to life, turning warm against the bedding. He stripped off his quilted vest and tucked it along the whelping ring to hold pockets of air. Grace gathered the smallest male, scout, stubborn jaw working, under her shirt against the skin of her belly. Luna, the too bright female, had already nosed her brothers into the fattest arc of warmth like a foreman counting heads. The light went out. It didn't fade. It died. Daylight from the stairwell fell in a square across the floor. The room shrank to the circle of what Grace could touch. She heard Nova's breath stay steady, felt 15 small movements shift into seeking. She sat cross-legged, the puppy against her skin, the back of her hand on Nova's ribs to feel each exhale. Mallory's phone cast a weak glow. He shielded it with his palm like a candle in a church. Count aloud, he said softly. Keep yourself steady while you keep them steady. Grace counted the way she had taught kids to count while bottle-feeding orphan lambs. 1, 2, 3. On 15, she started again, letting the rhythm build a fence around panic. Next to her, Nova pressed closer, making a half-moon of her body to trap the heat. From above, boots hammered past the stairwell. Torres's voice moved through rooms low and fast. Martha's came back in one-word brushstrokes that meant work was getting done. The building shuddered once, the generator catching, flared and died. Then in the vent, a new sound. A clicking rumble and the smell of diesel more than it should be. Trucks. Grace didn't have time to worry whether the engines belonged to friends or Vale's men before a shadow broke across the stairwell. Not Torres. Not Martha. Bigger, heavier, a man who had memorized the floor plan the way he'd tried to memorize Grace's face. Dr. Whitfield, Gideon Vale said, voice syrup soft. He kept his hands high, palms empty, a show for the recorders. The sheriff asked me to step inside. Given the power interruption, it seemed prudent that someone qualified assist. Nova did not growl. She lowered her head a fraction and showed the quietest strip of tooth Grace had ever seen, like a knife waiting rather than waving. Mallory rose without rising, somehow settling his weight between Vale and the ring. You can assist by stepping back out of my sterile space, he said. Chain of custody and biosecurity. Vale took one measured step down. He had no badge to show, no paper to press. He had a small aluminum case in his left hand, the size of a lunchbox. Mallory clocked it. So did Grace. So did Nova. Sedatives, Vale said lightly when he saw their eyes move. For safe transport. Stress kills neonates more reliably than genetics. He angled the case like he might be generous enough to use them well. Don't, Grace said. The word surprised all three of them, including Grace. It had an old worn seam of authority in it, barn voice, battlefield voice, kindergarten teacher voice. Vale stopped because some parts of men like Vale were trained to stop when a certain tone spoke. In the square of light from the stair, Agent Torres filled the frame. Her weapon was down but not unready, her badge visible and her breath just visible too. Back away from the stairs, Dr. Vale. Agent, he said, turning a shoulder. You and I both understand that if those animals fail today, your protective custody becomes a footnote and I become the villain who warned you. What I understand, Torres said, stepping down one tread, is that you cut the clinic's fuel line to force a crisis you hope to solve with your own hand, so it would be easier to carry out the next time. That's called tampering with evidence. Vale's smile didn't twitch. Prove it. Martha's voice came from the hall above, half muffled by the distance and half sharpened by the wind. Already did. We've got prints on a utility knife at the generator housing, and a very expensive pair of boots with fresh diesel on the soles. Your boys are slow about wiping their feet. For the first time, the neat line of Vale's expression failed. A thin white seam appeared along his jaw. He set the aluminum case on the step where a camera would see the gesture, an offering, and lifted his hands a little higher. Let's not turn this into an arrest, he said. But there was less sermon in it now and more rail. Turn around, Torres said. In that small, taut instant before he decided whether he believed her, the generator blew back to life. The red heat lamp cracked on with a pop. The vent sighed warm air. The cellar bloomed into a low living glow. Nova's shoulders loosened 1/2 inch. Luna pushed her face into the new heat and fell asleep like a switch flipped. Scout headbutted Grace's ribs to announce that he, for one, had no intention of growing up careful. Vale exhaled. You could hear the calculation switch tracks, plans rewriting themselves in his chest. He pivoted like a man stepping into a new angle for the camera, and then he moved. Not for Torres, for Grace. He slid 2 treads with a speed that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the decision made 20 minutes ago. He reached for the ring with one long step meant to vault 2 more. Nova hit him like a door on a spring. She didn't roar. She did not make a sound at all. 45 kilos of mother went up and into his center of mass with the economy of a creature built to end arguments. Vale's feet lost the stair. He grabbed for the wall and caught air. Torres was already moving, bone-deep trained steps, but physics moves faster than people. Vale's back hit the riser and he board-slid 2 treads, hip cracking the edge of a third. The case skittered, toppled, popped. Vials clinked and rolled like marbles. Nova. Grace's voice pressed the air like a hand. The dog stopped as if the word held a leash, eyes white with the work of it, chest heaving. She backed, placing her body between the pups and the stair. Every line saying, if you come down here again, there will be no more words. Torres's knee-pinned Vale clean and efficient, and the cuffs ratcheted around wrists that had probably never known the grip of anything rougher than a fundraiser handshake. Gideon Vale, she said, the words the weight they were meant to be. You are under arrest for tampering with evidence, attempted unlawful entry, and violation of a federal protective custody order. He laughed once, a dry, incredulous sound. For trying to save my life's work? Grace was standing now, one palm on Nova's shoulder, the other cradling the pup against her ribs. She did not come up the stairs. She did not move to the drama. She looked at the vials that had rolled to the edge of the landing and thought of all the things men have put in bottles and called help. Your life's work is learning how to say, "Good dog," without hurting anybody, she said. You should have tried that first. Martha appeared at the top of the stairs with 2 deputies behind her. We'll need your case and your boots, she told Vale, as if they were discussing a broken tail light. And we'll need your men to go sit in their cars and think about small towns. They moved him out in a river of cold air and controlled noise. Torres stayed long enough to lower herself one stair and meet Grace's eyes at the bottom. You held 30, she said, a thin smile cracking the hard line of the afternoon. You held it with interest. Don't make me do it again today, Grace said, and the humor of it diffused something tight in both of them. Mallory slid the last heat pack into place and checked Nova's gums in the red light. Good color, he murmured. You did perfect, Mama. He glanced up. Judge's order buys us days. The arrest buys us time, but his lawyers will buy motions by the dozen. We should document obsessively and recruit the kind of allies who write nicer letters than I do. I know a few, Torres said, starting with a state vet who owed me one and just paid it twice. Grace stood then, only slowly registering that her knees had been on concrete for too long and her back had a new story to tell. She set Scout back with a sibling and watched him instantly forget that humans had ever been useful. Nova rested her chin on Grace's knee with the solemn thank you of a creature who understood more than science prefers. Upstairs, the clinic changed registers from urgency to aftermath. Sheriff Collins stood at the counter making a log entry in handwriting as square as fence posts. One deputy bagged the aluminum case. The other signed a property form with a grim satisfaction that said he'd spent too many afternoons watching men like Vale talk around women like his mother. Torres came back from the porch with snow in the hem of her coat. Marshals are taking Vale, she said. We're placing 2 agents at the rear access and 1 by the generator until a welder can cage it. The judge authorized a temporary camera inside this foyer. Pointed at the door, nothing else. You'll have a copy of every minute. If anyone tries another trick, it won't be a he said, she said. It'll be a he did we watched, Grace nodded. The sentence felt like a blanket being tucked at the corners. Thank you, she said, and found the words had edges of bone in them. Gratitude. Yes, and a ledger. Martha slid a fresh pot onto the warmer and poured coffee into a paper cup that had held a different coffee this morning, the one Vale had left like a calling card. She dropped it into the trash with a look that would curdle paint. Town's going to hear about this, she said mildly. They'll want to bring casseroles you didn't ask for. Let them, Grace said, surprising herself in the room. But tell them to bring space heaters and diesel first. Martha's mouth tipped. Done. In the slow hour after the arrest, the clinic filled with a different kind of traffic. Jake Thompson arrived with an old Mr. Heater, and 3 quilts his late wife had sewn for nights just like this before men with briefcases invented new nights. He set the heater in the hall and went over the welds on its regulator as if a mistake would personally insult him. 2 teenagers from the 4-H club came with thermoses and 1 solemn, enormous extension cord. Mrs. Ramirez from the bodega in town drove in with a bag of tamales and the fierce eye of somebody who knew how to pick a fight that mattered. Grace kept moving, because movement is the only way to trick fear into sitting down. She charted weights and times. She wrote Scout and Luna in the margins where numbers wanted to be the whole story. She sent Torres's agents away with paper cups and strict instructions about stomping. She stood at the foot of the cellar stairs longer than she knew she was standing there, listening to the steady heat hum and the small sounds that meant the world was still working underneath. The afternoon folded into a blue-edged winter dusk. On the ridge across the pasture, a coyote called once and went quiet, a note of wildness that didn't know it was an argument for anything. The clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed their thin hive song. Somewhere in town, a plow finally clanked down County Road 9, flinging dirty ice to the ditches like it could erase the day. Agent Torres leaned on the door jamb and read Hank's Founder's Day photo with a soft, private expression. Your husband had a steadiness most men don't, she said. He did, Grace said. He wrote me a letter I wish I'd never had to read. Torres nodded like she understood both halves of that sentence. Tomorrow morning I'll bring the paperwork that makes this sanctuary official for 72 hours. By then, the U.S. Attorney will have decided whether to file a motion to extend. There will be news cameras at the end of the lane. If you don't want to be on TV, I'll stand in front of it. If you do, say welfare and humane and evidence until those words can't wriggle out of their meaning in a courtroom. Grace smiled, and this time it reached more than the corner of her mouth. You'd make a good barn lawyer. I come from a long line of them, Torres said. Then more quietly, you did good today, Dr. Whitfield, not just the medicine. The line holding. I had help, Grace said, from a mama who understands stakes. They both looked down unconsciously, toward the place in the floor where heat rose and new life worked without the dignity of metaphor. The building felt different now, not just protected by paper, but buffered by a town that had decided it liked its vet and her stubbornness more than it liked men with neat hair. As Torres left to confer with the posted agents, Grace went down to the cellar one last time, switching off her practical mind long enough to say a small prayer without worrying who it was for. Nova lifted her head. The pupils were wide in the red light, but there was no fear in them. Only the living, unsentimental calculation of a mother who would do the necessary thing, 2 breaths before it needed doing. Grace sat on the bottom step, as close as she could be without being in the way, and let the hush wrap around them. We're not done, she whispered. But we're on a road that doesn't go back. Nova breathed out through her nose, a sound that could have been agreement if you wanted it to be. Scout, of course, woke to that tiny noise and made a beeline for the one spot on Grace's jeans that was both clean and warm. Luna lifted her head like she was checking a coordinate and put it back down the way geniuses do when they've decided a problem will still be there tomorrow. Upstairs. Through the open vent, a kettle began to sing. It startled Grace that it could sing at all after a day like this. She stood, joints reporting in, and took one last look at the impossible family in the red glow. 15 small lives, and one big one whose scarred body had become a fort. In the amber of early evening, she climbed toward the sound of the kettle and the murmur of people who had not run away. Outside, the sky over Marlin Creek went the flat pink you only get after storms. Like God had dragged a thumb across the horizon to smooth it out. Inside, the old clinic, patched, welded, stubborn, held its warmth. Tomorrow would bring press, motions, men in ties, and 1,000 hands reaching for something they had not earned. But tonight, the line was still where she'd set it, and the town had learned where to stand. The morning after the arrest broke clean and bright, the kind of Texas winter light that makes everything look honest whether it is or not. Frost lashed the grass in white, and the creek behind the clinic moved under a skin of ice like a slow animal. Grace woke before the alarm to the familiar chorus of newborn noise filtered through the floor. Tiny needs, sleepy squeaks, Nova's low chest hum that meant the milk was down and everybody was busy. She brewed coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking and stood a moment at the window. 2 black Suburbans sat nose out at the end of the lane, federal agents tucked inside with the resigned posture of people who had learned to be patient in ugly weather. Sheriff Collins's Tahoe idled up front, lights off, a thermos parked on the dash. Beyond them at the county road, a local news van had already found the ditch like metal was attracted to mud, and a young reporter in a too-thin coat practiced an earnest face into a phone. Agent Torres arrived on foot, crunching across the gravel, coat zipped all the way for once. She lifted a gloved hand and Grace answered with a nod that had grown familiar fast. Paperwork, Torres said as soon as the door clicked shut behind her. 72-hour protective custody on site signed last night. I've asked the U.S. attorney to petition for an extension. Until then, we play everything by the book. What does the book say about reporters? Grace asked, handing her coffee. It says you don't owe them a thing, Torres said. But if you want to say something, say animal welfare, humane custody, and evidence preservation in the same sentence 3 times. It boxes Sable Ridge's lawyers in later. No details, no numbers, no mother's name. Grace nodded. I can do that. She hesitated. And Vale? Transferred to Waco overnight, Torres said. He'll see a magistrate this morning. His attorneys will file motions you and I don't have time to read. Let them file, Grace said, surprised at the steadiness in her voice. I've got bottles to sterilize. They went to work. Torres set her laptop on Hank's old desk and began the bureaucratic waltz, emails to people who insisted on reading everything twice, phone calls to offices where the morning didn't start until 9, digital signatures that felt both necessary and absurd. Grace lifted the trapdoor and descended into the warm red hush, her breath unconsciously sinking to Nova's. The pups had grown overnight in that miraculous way newborns do, cheeks plumper, paws less frantic, movement settling from flail to purpose. The smallest male had learned how to find the teat without fuss, a victory written nowhere but in Grace's notebook. Luna, bright as a headlamp under a blanket, tracked Grace's face with one eye even while nursing, as if taking attendance. "Good girl," Grace murmured, palming Nova's ribs to feel the slow, even tide. "You're making miracles the old-fashioned way." On her third weight check, trouble found her. The second runt, a narrow-headed female who slept too hard, went limp at the teat, latched wrong, and took a thready breath. Fluid wet her nose. "Aspiration," Grace said to no one already moving. She lifted the pup, inverted gently, 2 fingers at the ribcage, encouraging a cough while Nova watched with a mother's laser. A bead of milk slid free. The pup gasped, coughed once like a match struck in a damp room, then cried an offended tiny cry that made Grace's throat open again. "Okay," Grace whispered, setting the puppy against the heat while she primed a tiny syringe for a drop of warm glucose. "You scared me mean for a second." She marked an asterisk in the margin beside the pup's number, then wrote what she'd wanted to write since yesterday and hadn't let herself sage. Names tethered lives in her world. Saying them out loud made it harder for men with papers to unmake them. Back upstairs, Torres slid a form across the counter. "This recognizes your clinic as a temporary federal evidence facility with veterinary authority retained for welfare decisions." It sounds like it was written by a committee because it was. Grace scanned the blocks of legal rock face. "If I sign this, does anyone get to tell me when to feed them? If they try, call me," Torres said. "It says what I need it to say." Grace signed with the pen Hank used for Christmas cards, the ink biting deep into the page. Somewhere in town, a church bell tolled 9 on a lazy delay. On cue, the landline rang. "Whitfield, Ms. Whitfield, this is Aaron Cates with Channel 7. I'm at the end of your lane with Sheriff Collins. Could we get a statement for our viewers? The public has concerns." "The public is welcome to donate space heaters," Grace said before she could soften it. Then she took a breath. "I'll be out in 5 minutes." Torres opened her mouth to argue and then shut it again. "Say the words," she reminded gently. "I'll stand off camera and shake my head if you drift." They walked together into air that snapped at cheeks and made breath visible. Martha stood between the county road and the clinic like a lighthouse built out of denim. The young reporter started her questions before Grace made it to the fence. "Dr. Whitfield, what exactly is going on here? Are there dangerous animals inside? Does the federal government have you hiding evidence from the public?" Grace felt the old stubbornness settle like a coat and chose a voice that would carry without cutting. "I am providing humane custody to evidence animals under a judge's protective order, and I'm doing it according to veterinary standards of animal welfare," she said, clean and calm. "That means quiet, heat, and time. I won't discuss specifics that jeopardize their care or a federal investigation. Thank you for understanding. But, ma'am," Martha said pleasantly, "that's your statement. You can tape me saying, 'No comment,' 6 different ways, but it'll still be, 'No comment.'" The reporter's mouth snapped shut. Then somehow she smiled, the human part of her job peeking through the hustle. "Thank you, doctor," she said, and meant it a little. By noon, casseroles began to arrive in the time-honored order of small towns. Noodles first, then chilies, then 3 pans from the same church lady who believed in cream of something as medicine. Jake Thompson brought a space heater and a bucket of gravel for the porch steps, then stayed to replace light bulbs no one had asked him to replace. 2 FFA kids showed up with new boot mats and the posture of boys who wanted to be useful. Mrs. Ramirez posted on the bodega bulletin board that anyone hassling La Veterinaria would not be welcome to buy tamales on Fridays. That solved more problems than anyone could have predicted. Mallory returned with a portable infant incubator, modified for wildlife work. A clear tub with gentle airflow that looked like something you'd put a loaf of bread in if you loved it too much. "If the heat lapses again," he said, "this can buy you a cushion. No sedatives, no funny business." He set it on the counter like an apology for his entire agency's reputation. In the early afternoon, the clinic did the ordinary work that keeps crisis from becoming a personality. Grace changed the bedding and rotated the pups so each got the prime teat at least once. Nova drank broth and went out for a brief, supervised break to the pen behind the clinic, where she peed for 30 seconds straight with the emphatic relief of a mother who has held it too long. When a neighbor rolled in with a heeler that had tried to jump a 5-wire fence and lost, Grace stitched it on the front table with Torres holding a flashlight because the generator lights worked, but she'd learned long ago never to trust a single bulb. "Don't you have agents for this?" the neighbor asked Torres, more awed than suspicious. "I am the agent," Torres said dryly. "Today I'm also the lamp." Word filtered back after lunch. Vale had posted bond and was fitted with an ankle monitor, his lawyers already drafting statements about overreach and misunderstanding. Grace felt the information slide through her without catching. The idea of him out of a cell made her stomach clench, but the picture that mattered was the one under her floor. 15 breaths stacking like cordwood against the cold. Around 3. The state veterinarian joined on video from a beige office with a potted plant. She was the kind of woman who had learned to wear pearls to hearings where men called her Missy. She listened as Torres outlined the order and Mallory described the welfare plan. Then she looked straight into the camera and said, "Dr. Whitfield, are the animals stable? Are they suffering?" "They're stable," Grace said. "They are not suffering. They need quiet. They need their mother. And they need the law to stop changing the rules because someone with money is impatient." "Then my office recognizes the on-site plan as the least harmful option available," the state vet said. "Document everything. If anyone questions your charts, make them read them out loud." When the call ended, Grace stood with her hands on the counter for a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You know," she said to no one in particular. "Hank used to say the smartest thing you can do for an animal is keep your head. The second smartest is keep your records. Add a third," Torres said, signing another digital form. "Keep your friends." Dusk slid down the windows early. The agents at the lane clicked their headlights on and off once, the agreed-upon sign that a shift change was happening and all was calm. The news van left finally, hungry for a police blotter somewhere warmer. A thin band of cloud lit fire along the western pasture and went out. Grace went downstairs one more time and took inventory with the eye that had stopped relying on numbers somewhere around year 15 of practice. Bellies round, ears twitching in sleep. Nova drowsy but alert. One forepaw hooked across the whelping ring like she owned it and would die on it. Sage, the aspirator, slept hard on Luna's shoulder. A tiny stripe of milk dried on her nose like chalk. Tomorrow, "The feds will bring me more paper," Grace told them softly. "The way you talk to babies when you're really talking to yourself. Tomorrow men in ties will say big words like they're strong. But we did today, and tomorrow has to respect that." When she climbed, she found Jake sitting in the lobby with a mop across his knees like a guitar. He stood fast and awkward, a man who never got used to the mechanics of grief around others. He handed her an envelope. "Folks took up a little collection at Eunice's," he said, eyes on the floor, "for feed and diesel. And coffee. I told them you drink the cheap stuff, but nobody listens to me." Inside 20s and 10s wadded by hands not used to folding money for gifts. And a note in pencil from one of the 4-H kids, the loops big and careful. "Thank you for helping the mom dog. I can feed the cats at night if you need." Grace's throat tightened with something more useful than tears. "Tell them thank you," she said. "Tell them we're okay. Tell them to keep calling the sheriff if they see strange trucks where they don't belong." After Jake left, the clinic sighed into quiet. Mallory packed his case, promising to return at dawn with extra thermometers and a printout of a protocol that managed to be both meticulous and kind. Torres made one last loop, checked the generator cage, spoke briefly to the road agents, and came back inside looking taller than she had that morning. "Go sleep a few hours," she told Grace. "I'll stay with the foyer camera feed and wake you if a snowflake twitches wrong." Grace almost refused out of habit. Then she saw the point in Torres's eyes. Leadership isn't martyrdom. It's delegation that keeps the lights on. 2 hours, she said. If I snore, it's because I earned it. She lay down on the office couch Hank had pretended not to nap on for 20 years and closed her eyes. The building talked to her the way old buildings do when you belong to them. Timbers settling, heater ticking, a soft draft remembering a corner. Beneath it all, the bass note of breath and milk and the slow, untheatrical work of being alive. When she woke near midnight, the clinic was amber with low light. Torres sat at Hank's desk with a half-eaten tamale on a napkin, and 3 monitors open to feeds that showed nothing more dramatic than snow dusting a porch rail. She looked up with the soft startle of someone caught being human at her post. Quiet? Grace asked. Quiet, Torres said. Vale's lawyers filed for a temporary injunction to remove the animals to secure facilities. The judge assigned rolled his eyes in writing. Grace smiled without showing her teeth. Good judge. Good moment, Torres said. Moments are all any of us get. Grace poured tea and went down the stairs without turning on the overheads. In the red glow, Nova lifted her head and for the first time since the storm, wagged once. It wasn't enthusiasm. It was recognition. You stayed. You will stay again. Grace lowered herself to the concrete and put both palms on the warm wood of the ring. We've got one more part in us, she whispered, thinking of the story that had unspooled without her permission into the life she was living. One more push. Then we'll decide what forever looks like. Above her, the old clinic breathed. Outside, the frost crept again across the pasture like lace. At the end of the lane, a taillight blinked as an agent shifted in his seat, keeping watch the way a town watches when it remembers what the word means. Under the floor, 15 small hearts beat the next day closer. By first light, the cold had softened, the creek throwing off a thin steam like a horse after a long ride. In the office, Agent Torres had left a note under a paperweight shaped like the state of Texas. Hearing at 10. Judge Harper. Bring your charts. Grace read it twice, slipped Hank's pen into her pocket, and went downstairs to say good morning to the reason for all the paper. Nova greeted her with the quiet dignity of a mother who had kept the world running through the night. 15 small bodies sprawled and stacked in the red glow like embers in a pit, breathing, twitching, unconcerned with federal procedure. Sage, the little aspirator, slept with her mouth barely open. A smudge of milk dried at the corner like she'd been caught stealing. Scout had migrated sideways until his back pressed against the ring as if guarding the perimeter in his sleep. Luna watched with one eye, then decided even geniuses get to rest. You made it through another one, Grace whispered, palming Nova's ribs for the count only her hands needed. Now it's our turn. At the courthouse annex in town, the heat clicked and thunked with municipal insistence. Judge Harper wore a navy sweater under her robe, and the polite impatience of someone who had hay to feed later and didn't intend to waste daylight. Gideon Vale was video-fed from Waco, a square of careful light and legal language. His jaw set in a way that said his attorneys had warned him to act like a man, not a martyr. Agent Torres laid out the bones of it, the cut fuel line, the arrest, the on-site plan that had, despite sabotage, kept 15 neonates warm, fed, and with their mother. Dr. Theo Mallory described welfare protocols with the soft gravitas of a man who had learned the difference between humane and convenient. Sheriff Collins spoke 8 sentences that landed like fence posts. Then it was Grace's turn. She didn't rehearse. She held the ledger she'd kept since the blizzard and told the story the way vets do when time and detail are both a kind of mercy. Birth weights, midnight temperatures, times of nursing, brief excursions to urinate, the moment the generator died and the exact second they got it back, the glucose drop that pulled a pup across a line. No flourish, no plea. Just the record, a map of minutes. When she finished, the room felt closer to the ground. Judge Harper looked at Vale's square on the screen. Dr. Vale, your motion requests immediate transfer of the animals to a third-party research facility under your advisory. The record before me includes evidence of tampering in an active criminal case. Even setting that aside, the animals are neonates. Separation from their dam would be harmful, per the state veterinarian's opinion. Motion denied. Protective custody on site is extended for 90 days. Enforcement shared by federal and county authorities. Welfare decisions remain with Dr. Whitfield, subject to oversight by APHS and the state vet. Vale's lawyer started to object. Harper lifted a hand. Counsel, today is not your victory. You may file. Dr. Vale will continue to enjoy due process. The animals will continue to enjoy oxygen and milk. Court is adjourned. Outside, the winter sun found the courthouse steps and the world smelled briefly like thawed dirt. Martha clapped Grace once on the shoulder, a kindness disguised as a jolt. Torres let herself smile all the way to her eyes. 90 days, she said. We'll use everyone. They did. Days became a rhythm that made sense to bodies even when the headlines did not. Morning weights and temperatures. Nova's slow lap of the yard always 2 minutes longer than yesterday. Scout's insistence on carrying a towel half his size out to the pen like he'd found a job. Luna's first problem to solve. How to open the latch to the supply closet, which led to a second problem, solved by a carabiner, and a note that read, Luna is smarter than we are. Town kept showing up. Jake emptied ash from the wood stove that had no business being as vital as it became. Mrs. Ramirez organized a rota of teenage hands for chores labeled, Don't lift, Don't drop, Don't distract the mother. 2 FFA girls learned newborn exams from Grace's hands and later taught a state inspector how to do it gently. A church group left casseroles on the porch with cards full of scripture and recipes. A biker club left space heaters and a cash envelope with a sticky note, for diesel. Keep receipts or don't. H. Vale filed motions as predictably as the weather changed. Some got hearings, most didn't. Once a courier served Grace papers at dusk and she signed the receipt with Hank's pen while Nova watched from the yard, her gaze flat and calm. We do not panic for paper. The county learned to ignore black SUVs that idled too long by the road. Agents learned where to buy kolaches that didn't taste like punishment. By week 5, eyes were open. Ears had found their lift. Personalities had drawn themselves in ink. Scout loved the sound of his own feet and the geometry of doorways. Luna learned the rhythm of the gate latch and the patience of waiting until no one watched. Sage developed the kind of quiet that scares doctors and comforts calves. She could sit with a feverish stray and make the dog breathe slower without touching it. By week 8, the first real snowmelt carved channels in the lot, and the juveniles swarmed the outdoor enclosure like a choir discovering harmony. Mallory brought an ethologist with a ponytail and soft hands who sat on a bucket and cried once. Not from sadness, just from seeing intelligence that wasn't asking to be tested. Torres leaned on the fence and pretended to study her phone while she gave the moment privacy. Court came around again in spring clothes. This time it was a federal courtroom with wood so polished the lights looked like a second world in it. The U.S. Attorney's Office wanted the judge to formalize what had been happening all winter. A sanctuary under protective order, veterinary custody with oversight, research limited to observation and voluntary participation, no invasive procedures, no breeding. The order read like a compromise written by people who'd been taught to distrust each other, but had chosen, for once, not to. Vale's face on the monitor was thinner, angrier but unwilling to say so on the record. He spoke about extinction curves and the moral math of species versus individuals. He was not entirely wrong. That was the problem and always had been. Grace didn't argue ethics. She told the court that Luna had figured out how to open the feed bin, and only does it to steal the scoop so she can carry it around like a prize. That Sage will go sit with post-op animals without prompting, then come back to check on Grace as if she's on the same chart. That Scout has started sleeping in front of the cellar door even though it's been open for weeks, like some doors never stop needing guarding. The judge listened longer than judges usually do. Then he signed the order and said, almost to himself, "Let us not save a world that we have hollowed out, gentlemen." Summer folded the pasture into a softer green. The creek dropped back into its banks. The juveniles shifted from milk to a careful diet that would not let their bodies outrun their joints. Torres stopped by on Sundays without a file in her hand. Her lamp-holding joke had turned into a friendship measured in thermoses, and the kind of silence people who've worked a bad night share without having to say which one. By fall, decisions, not the big theatrical ones, but the ones that make a life, came due. A pair of the juveniles left under escort, to live at a conservation education center 2 counties over. Their work to stand on a platform with a kind handler and make 4th graders catch their breath at the leap between wildness and home. Another young male moved to a ranch that did search and rescue training and failed spectacularly at tracking, but excelled at comforting, which turned out to be a job too. Luna stayed. No one even pretended otherwise. Sage stayed because leaving would have broken the clinic's logic. Nova aged into a piece that looked nothing like surrender. Her coat went richer. Her hips stayed sound with the kind of luck you don't say out loud. She learned that Torres kept liver treats in her breast pocket, and that Mallory hummed when he was nervous. She slept most afternoons in a patch of light Hank's stained glass suncatcher threw across the floor. And sometimes Grace would catch herself staring at that light and remembering a long-ago Founder's Day photograph and feel grief and gratitude swap places just long enough to breathe. One November evening, a year to the week from the blizzard, the town threw something they refused to call a party. The sign on the fence just said potluck and thanks, which in this county counted as an invitation and a command. People came with crock pots and paper plates and stories about the winter the generator died and the judge didn't. The juveniles watched from the enclosure with the mild interest of creatures who understand that gatherings are for the benefit of the two-legged sheriff. Collins made a speech that wasn't a speech. Mallory tried not to and failed, and everyone liked him better for it. Torres said 3 sentences, all short, all true. Grace didn't intend to say anything, but somebody handed her a microphone built for bingo nights, and she found herself looking at faces she'd known most of her life and some she hadn't, and the words came. "I thought the storm was the end of something," she said. "It was the start. I thought the law was a machine you survive. It turned out to be people, these people showing up when it mattered. I thought family was a thing you lose and never get back. Turns out you can build it from strangers, dogs, kids with extension cords, and one very patient federal agent. Thank you for letting us keep what belongs to all of us, our own idea of what humane means." She set the microphone down because any more would have turned true into pretty, and the town had no appetite for that. Jake started a song he'd sung at more funerals than anyone should, but it sounded like a blessing out under the security lights. Later, when the tables were folded and the last crock-pot reclaimed, Grace walked the fence line alone. Cold threaded the low ground. The sky went that hard Texas black that makes stars look like holes punched through to daylight on the other side. Nova fell in step without being asked. Scout trotted ahead, nose busy. Luna slid sideways like a ghost and reappeared at the gate, pretending she hadn't been testing it. Sage pressed her shoulder to Grace's knee and stayed there, a warm weight requesting nothing. At the far corner where the fence angled toward the creek, Grace stopped. From the road came the soft idle of a Suburban she recognized by sound alone, and felt oddly comforted to know it was there. She rested both hands on the top wire the way Hank used to, and let the pastures lay themselves out in front of her. What had been, what was, what might be if you stayed. "You're home," she told Nova, and realized she meant all of them, including herself. Back inside, she made a last round the way ritual demands. Bowls, bedding, vent. She stood at the cellar door even though no one slept down there anymore and listened anyway, because the body keeps its checkpoints. Upstairs the kettle clicked. The clinic smelled like bleach and coffee and clean fur. In the office, Hank's pen lay on the blotter where she'd left it after signing the latest inspection form with a hand that didn't shake. On her desk sat a letter with a federal return address. She'd opened it earlier and left it for later, the way you do with news that is good enough to savor. It certified what everyone already knew. Mitchell and Whitfield Veterinary, authorized sanctuary under protective custody order, 23 to 1847, with extended term and ethical research partnership, observation only. The seal looked less like government than like permission. Grace turned off the foyer light and left the desk lamp on for Torres, who would pretend she needed it. She wrote 3 words on the day's chart before she forgot and smiled when she saw what they were, all accounted for. In the dark that isn't really dark when a place knows you, she lay down on the office couch and listened to the building breathe. Above the faint mechanical hum came other sounds that mattered more. A tail thumping once under a desk, the slow stretch of a dog in her sleep, wind curling around the eaves like a cat finding a warmer side of the house. Somewhere in her chest a knot she had grown used to eased, not all at once, but enough. Morning would bring more papers and more eyes. Men in ties would still say inevitable like it was a virtue, but the line was drawn where it needed to be and the town knew how to stand on it now. The pups would keep teaching by existing. The law would keep learning one small clause at a time, what welfare means when the ledger includes love. Grace closed her eyes to the soft chorus of a life assembled out of weather and will. If the blizzard had been Judgment Day, then this ordinary night full of breath and small noises was the verdict. Family, it turned out, wasn't something she'd lost and found again. It was something she had learned to build, to guard, and to share, and in a little clinic on the edge of a Texas town under a sky stitched with frost and stars, it was enough. And that is how one stormy night, one frightened mother dog and one unexpected birth changed an entire town forever. What began as a mystery inside a small, cold clinic became a story of courage, loyalty, and the fight to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Dr. Grace, the police, and the people of Marlin Creek stood together when no one else would. And because of that, 15 extraordinary lives were saved. Sometimes the world reveals its secrets in the most unexpected ways, not through science or power, but through compassion and the courage to do what is right. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful real-life inspired stories, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. Thank you for staying with us. We will meet again in the next story.